Opponent ready.
I don't see the doc yet. Just give me 1 second.
Okay. Just let me know when you get the doc. I resent it just in case it didn't send or something.
Okay, I got it.
Okay. You good?
Yep.
We never got off the slave to the violent regulation of blackness that started on the middle passage continues today through forms of surveillance. That's round 15. This one makes individual changes by employing simple instruments. Surveillance sought to objectify, transform, and improve individuals through examination, architectural design, registration, documentation, examination, slave tracking, ports and ports. And on slaves during the middle passage away from Africa to the Ashtabon's plantations were always violent regulation of blacks as spectacle disciplinary, combining the racialized surveillance of the slave system here. Black children, women, and men were subjected to these simple but violent instruments, branding arms, the branding of enslaved people as a means of accounting for a particular shifts, cargo, not only individualizing, but also a massifying practice that constituted a new category of the subject, blackness as a saleable commodity. Plantation rules laid out for overseas and the prescribed measures of the regulating plantation life and social death, the acts of making the black body eligible as property were put to work, and the protection of the slave as venable. And the policing and regulation of blackness was key to the plantation. The surveillance of the black body through predictive policing was only a continuation of this. That's round 15. The timetable then was made by regimenting enslaved labor through repetition work with no attempt to account for every moment of slave life. So the prescribed punishment must be performed as pain and experienced by the overseers to express the possibility that partaking in performing acts of violence that a rule needs to be put in place in order to prevent displays of violence. The leads to the question of which the pleasure was really expressed when plantation sought to make discipline and pleasure and vice versa. Plantation surveillance was an exercise of both sovereign and power and racialized disciplinary power working in plantation societies to render slave life expendable. Plantation surveillance as the earliest form of surveillance practiced in America. This was a system of surveillance that was regulated through violence through the written world. In the plantation system, the restricted mobility and literacy of the enslaved, the exercise of power, the racialized surveillance of the slave pass system was always a violent regulation of black mobility. On and off the plantation, black mobility needed to be tightly regulated in order for slave owners to maintain control. And the use of predictive policing is concentrated in historically black neighborhoods under the guise that black bodies necessitate constant policing. That's Benjamin 19. Atlantic Zone 4 was one of the 2 police zones where credible was originally tested in the city, an area of historically black neighborhoods, popularly presented as a persistent problem area. These technologized practices supplement historical geography to racialized threat rather than imagine them new. The built environment has historically been announced with a threat predicted and weaponized to the mobility and presence of blacks. The history of Zone 4 usually points towards forms of policing that both deal in circuits of racialized mobility and appropriate acquisition for perceived racialized status, the environmental phenomenon in which war must be waged, the circuits of policing whereby pre-intervention operationalized not only by the state but by deputized groups such as the KKK and the broader citizenry, particularly through militarized language and the logic contained the perceived what is to be perceived as a creeping racialized threat. Digital technologies use the police to produce spaces and emerge the historical confluences of place, racialized threat, and the weaponization of the built environment, rather than affirming discourses of militarization of police that have predominated media discussions. Instead, conflicts between military and civil policing and preemption about how these practices produce particular environments as criminogenic sites to be contained. And the data produced contains the semiotics of the plantation, the preemptive logic of predictive policing, justified surveillance and over-policing by weaponizing the lived experiences of black folk, creating instabilities and rendering acts of violence to be necessary for white safety. That's Benjamin 19. Predictive policing records of state violence and racist contours of American history are seen that we live in the wake of the still unfolding aftermath of American chattel slavery. In that wake, the semiotics of slavery continue from the forced movements of the enslaved to the forced movements of the migrant and the refugees, the forced regulation of black people in North American streets and neighborhoods. Available software does not and cannot know who will commit what crimes, or we will never know such thing because crime is a social relation produced by the state and the police. The organizing logic of American criminal justice is not premised on the individuated guilt and punishment, but on the state sanctioned or extra legal production production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. In the inverted world of predictive policing, group differentiated vulnerability is translated into probable criminal risk. Predictive policing software uses almost every conceivable measure of vulnerability and victimization under American racial capitalism. Translates the lived realities of oppression into speculated likelihood of something called crime. In doing so, it rationalizes the lie that Black, brown, queer, and poor people and the places where they live are intrinsically threatening to the broader public. Predictive policing programs employ prevailing criminological theories to mold it, to project these models into the future, geospatially rendered probabilities of the violence and disruption. Race-bind algorithms to model future crime are at best denying the entanglements between race, carcerality, and capital. Predictive policing systems refigure contact between police and the police as a site of punitive data accumulation. This, in turn, feeds a self-sustaining logic of intelligence gathering so that reformation becomes indistinguishable from technologies of sovereign control. And thus, I affirm the resolution as an act of recognizing the life at the edge of the world. That's Woods 19. When the sheriff's deputy assaulted a Black girl in South Carolina high school, the violence had already been invited inside the community institutions. One Black female student bravely fought, seemed up to the officer to protest her classmates' treatment. Both girls were arrested on the charge of disrupting schools. This policing rhetoric is historically constant in the goal of transferring Black people and its perpetrators and the harms they enjoy. The police power has been able to render the long-standing practice of Black self-defense illegitimate, as when Cora Gaines used a shotgun to defend herself or family in her home against police intrusion. Eventually, the police opened fire, killing Gaines. Armed self-defense, the third role of Black self-determination, surveillance of Blackness, and dissemination of blood-stained records follows, thus stands at odds with the acts of marionage by everyday Black folks like Gaines. When Black people express some of the ideas associated with sovereign citizen movement, it turns everything on its head. They are directly contesting anti-Blackness, intrinsic not only to the U.S. nation state, but the very notion of sovereignty itself. Gaines was attempting to strike the fungible Blackness at the heart of the modern world. This gesture, symbolic on her part since he had no means to make it real, but her belief in line with sovereign citizen ideology is a dead end for Black people. As soon as all this became clear to me, I developed the nerve to admit it to myself that we were defeated in war and we are not captive slaves, or we actually inherited a neo-slave existence. I immediately became relaxed, always expecting the worst, and started working on the remedy. Life at the edge is a condition of marionage and ethical honesty about structural vulnerability. Understand the present political problem in terms of the Black historical struggle. Divest from law, from policing, from capitalist culture, from the false freedoms of gender, sex, and from any program that does not hold itself accountable to Blackness. And thus, the role of the ballot is to surrender to Blackness. This grammatical imperative marks the only possible revolutionary practice. Surrendering to Blackness means that recognizing the anti-Black structures of contemporary race relations. Your role as a judge is to endorse the surrender to the demands of Blackness. That's Raider Miller 14. Black fresh cards on the level of the ontological world order surrender Blackness came at the level of foundations thought and being themselves as their new for revolutionary practice. It must centralize Blackness. The unthought question remains if you ever truly earn the right to act in solidarity. Anti-Blackness is singular with no equivalent force. And we can understand anti-Blackness as a general concept applied to the very unspeakable force of Black death. Coalition politics are fetishized. The fetishized is necessary recognition that anti-Blackness coalition's heart. Cut the card at heart. I'm open for CX.
All right, cool. Okay. So should police exist? Should police exist, like in the real world we live in right now? Should police exist?
I would say that the current police system is pretty anti-Black.
Okay, well, should there be some way to enforce like laws we write through legislation and things like that? Should we have some way to enforce laws?
I would say that the 1AC doesn't specifically speak to enforcing the laws, and you would be asking the wrong questions, right? It's not a question of like necessarily should we have police, but rather the police system we have right now is really bad. This can be seen by all of the continuous police brutality that has been happening over the past few weeks, months, years.
Sure, it's the right question because you're talking about like militarization towards like Black people. Isn't any sort of enforcement of a law like militarization towards anybody, right?
No, we would say that enforcing the law, it's just the idea of the idea of laws is not what militarization is. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that police see Black bodies as inherently criminal. And this leads to over-policing and this militarization concept, right? That we need to protect ourselves because Black people are scary and dangerous. That's this. Okay, that's what we're talking about, the militarization of the police and this idea that they are kind of a sort of need to protect themselves from Black bodies. That's what we're talking about.
Okay, how do you solve for like over-policing?
Yeah, right. So what we say is what we need to do is affirm the resolution that as an act of recognizing life at the edge of the world. So we give the example of how whenever Black people try to engage within the system and use their rights, it ends up failing. This can be seen that by Corinne Gaines. We give the example of how police came into her home unannounced and she didn't know what was going on and she didn't do anything wrong. And she tried to defend herself by using her Second Amendment rights, but ended up dying, right? So we're saying that.
What if it succeeds? What if Black people using their rights succeeds and like getting what they want?
we would say that working within the system and using our current system to try to go up, it doesn't work, which is the reason why like people.
So we can't use our system. So we need like an entirely new system.
I would say that that we don't necessarily speak to the creation of. We don't necessarily speak to that, but rather
okay.
that.
So what you're saying is
what the one functions as? Do you want me to? Do you want to?
Oh well, I want to ask another question. So what you're saying is, yeah, sure. We can't we can't use the current system, but also you're not speaking to any other system that could be usable.
Let me explain what I mean. Right. So specifically at the bottom of the Woods 19 card, it talks about how we should divest from the ideas of laws and policing as our only way to create hope. Right. This can be seen as how, like, for instance, like the Black Panther Party created grassroots strategies to actually help their community. Right. So we're saying is that using the law to create change is not what's working for Black people, right? It doesn't create any sort of structural change. So we need to divest from that idea that by just using our rights, we're going to be able to fight back, because that hasn't historically created structural change.
Okay. Setting prep on now. Okay, I'm gonna send the doc out. All right, cool. Tell me when you get it. All right, cool. So I'm gonna present my case and then move on to your case specifically. So cool. Okay. I negate resolved. Predictive policing is unjust. To clarify today's round, I offer a definition for predictive policing from the National Institute of Justice. Predictive policing leverages computer models for anticipating likely crime events. Predictions focus on variables such as places, people, groups, or incidents. Demographic trends, parole populations, and economic conditions may all affect crime rates in particular areas. Prior crime and environmental data can help police reduce the number of crime incidents. I value justice defined as giving each their due because one, it directly pertains to the wording of the resolution, and two, because all humans share an intrinsic worth that guarantees certain dues from the government, including proper policing. The criterion is minimizing structural violence. You prefer the standard for these reasons. One, minimizing structural violence is a prerequisite to giving every person the deserved human rights. Two, a government or institution that's policing that doesn't seek to minimize structural violence will at the same time make it as if they can violate the rights of the minority because only the majority is of importance. And three, the power disparity within citizen law enforcement interactions is already large enough. Pushing minority groups farther than the totem pole only makes it more likely that the issue will never be solved. Contention one, predictive policing benefits public security. Professor of Public Innovation Albert Meyer writes in 2020, Levine, Tish, Castle, and Joy assess the domain awareness system, a system of network, a network of sensors, databases, and infrastructure that delivers information on mobile devices and precinct desktops. The authors compare traditional policing with traditional policing with predictive software and the accuracy of predicting burglary, felony assault, robberies, and shootings. In a 24-week cross-validation period, the accuracy of predictions have increased, especially for shootings. Officers can respond faster on shootings through ShotSpotter, which registers the sounds of shootings. Overall, the crime index of New York decreased 6% since the implementation of the DAS. It's important that communities are actually secure from violent crimes because, as Black Professor Ed Reed puts it, based on everything I've been able to observe, African Americans mostly are over-policed but underprotected. The DAS is taking attention away from petty crimes, which is what's over-policed, and putting resources into major violent crimes, which is the underprotecting part Professor Reed references. Contention 2, predictive policing mitigates human bias. Sub 1A is law enforcement. There are two predictive systems that dominate the field. Predpol is the first, Fish 19. Predpol, the market leader in predictive policing, works with 50 police departments representing roughly 20,000 total patrol officers across the U.S. Law Professor Andrew Ferguson, who literally opposes predictive policing, admits that Predpol doesn't use biased data. Predpol does not predict drug crimes and does not use arrest in its algorithm, precisely because the company knows the results to be racially discriminatory. Therefore, the algorithm doesn't consider any agenda, and the creators themselves go the extra mile to stop bias. The only other predictive system that doesn't that compares to the influence of Predpol is Spot Shutter, which is used in over 100 police departments. The debate should really revolve around these two. Finally, the technology is relatively new, and the trend is towards less bias. The removal of the SSL in Chicago is evidence of this, born in 2020. Grant money used to develop the SSL ran out, leading to its cancellation on November 1st. The police department's chief spokesman said this decision reflects a shift in strategy to rely on technology centers inside police districts. The tech centers offer computer programs and specialized tools, including gunshot detection technology called Spot Shutter and surveillance cameras for officers to track violence in real time. The ACLU of Illinois praised this decision to end the use of the SSL. The fact that traditional policing for a very long time has been so corrupt, what we've been able to spot out and get rid of bias in a 10-year time span, like in Chicago, demonstrates that predictive policing is ultimately good for minorities. Subpoint B is crime prediction in courts, Ludwig 19. Judges decide if defendants await trial at home or in jail, predicting whether they're likely to flee or commit crimes. For judges, this task requires thinking that might be infected by racial biases. Human judges detain far more people than needed. Algorithms make more accurate predictions. They limit jail just to those who are truly high risk. In New York City, use of algorithms will reduce the jail population by 40%, and who would benefit the most? The African American and Latino communities, from which nearly 9 of 10 jail inmates are drawn. Because this impact and the others I've already read can only occur in a world with predictive policing, I negate and move on to my opponent's case. So we're going to be going down by author to author, like to address my opponent's case. So on the first piece of evidence, on the Brown evidence, where they talk about how like we never got off the slave ship and things like that, and they talk about surveillance. This entire author like doesn't matter because surveillance isn't predictive policing. It's not resolutional. They're arguing a lot off topic, but like I'll just address different things that may be on topic. So on the next piece of evidence on Brown 2, they say that policing was key to plantations and things like that. But just because something may be key to something unjust in the past doesn't mean it's inherently unjust now. Like if you see see a Nazi like driving a car down the street, that doesn't mean you can't drive that car. That just means you need to apply the technology they're using in a better way, in a more just way. And that's what I prove with predictive policing. Extend Ludwig here because it shows that if we use predictive policing in courts right now in New York City, if we use it tomorrow, 40% of the jail population would decrease by 40%, and that would help a lot of minorities. So if we're looking to the next piece of evidence, on the Benjamin piece of evidence, they basically said that predictive policing is used in Black neighborhoods. First, this happens even if it's disproportionate. It happens because Black neighborhoods have like disproportionately more crime in them. And the reason for that is they're set back in terms of socioeconomic status because of things like slavery, things like Jim Crow, set them back, and now there's more crime in these areas. It isn't a bad thing to have good policing, and that's the second point. Predictive policing limits the amount of bias that can come about. So something like predpol, which only predicts major violent crimes, is a net good on Black communities and doesn't actually overpolice just like people smoking joints in the street or something. So next on the data produced like continues the plantation, and that's the Benjamin evidence again, and it talks about like white safety. But the thing is, like any like sort of referencing of what happened to people in the past, especially on plantations, is completely disrespectful to Black slaves. To compare the data used in predictive policing right now that overall benefits Black and brown people to the same data producing like the same racist results as what happened in slavery is absolutely disrespectful to any person who went through slavery over 100 years ago. And the only alternative to using this data is compounded bias. I'll explain what compounded bias is. So if we were to just give this bad data to like racist police officers, that would be much worse than giving it to an objective computer or objective algorithm. So they're walking over the bodies of people who were slaves in the past, and the alternative they can't provide, which is what I ask in Prospect. I'm like, what do we do about a society where we can't actually achieve anything good in the future? They say they don't, so they get to attack the status quo and don't have to defend anything, any sort of system that could exist. But I'm stuck here defending the status quo, which there's always going to be bias, but at least I'm trying to mitigate that. Look to the next piece of evidence where they talk about how they affirm as an action of like recognizing life at the edge of the world. Using rights, they talk about in Prospect about like how using rights won't end up like this girl in high school tried to use her Second Amendment right and it didn't work. But the thing is, and they ignore this in Prospect, is that using your rights can work. Like the loads of Black people that voted in Obama in 2008 and 2012 worked for them. They got what they want. The loads of Black people walking in Washington in 1964, it worked out for them. They ended up getting civil rights. It's not about deconstructing the entire system. It's about building a system that is better for Black people. Now, when we move on, they say that like the role is to surrender to Blackness. Again, this is a huge problem with the affirmative. No one cares about quote unquote surrendering to Blackness. Like the people, like the Latino people being threatened with deportation and their families deportation, don't care about surrendering to Blackness. They just want the rights granted to them for probably being born in the United States. And the Black people protesting the George Floyd killing they don't care about surrendering to Blackness. They just care about getting the right to deserve for being a human. Thank you. All right, I said it was
Okay, hold on just one second. All right, so what does the NC do?
The NC overall makes a better world for like people living just like minorities in general. So that's what the framing is, and that's what I achieve.
Okay, yeah. Why? I guess why is the predictive policing software uniquely good for people of color? Like, can you give any examples of how?
Because it limits the amount of bias that can come from humans.
Can you give me any examples of like how it's been used positively to impact communities?
The fact that predpol goes out of its way to like not predict drug crimes, which is what cops would do, and like not use historical crime data, which is skewed against Black people, is evidence to show that it's like a net gain than just like having normal like traditional policing.
Where do they get their data? How do they?
Where do they get their data?
How do they create these algorithms that presume where crimes are going to happen?
So I think it goes off of like crime location, crime time and date, and then crime type. Or like time and date and then type.
Right. So past crimes that have happened, or like crimes.
Yeah, not past arrest, and within like the last 6 months. That's where it goes off of. So if we were to use like historical crime data or historical arrest data, then we'd obviously be biased against minorities. But going off the
okay, why does using data 6 months ago less biased than data used
because if you continue to like not be biased in the way you practice it, then less and less Black people are going to be represented in the data, and then it becomes more and more fair for everybody.
Okay, how do you ensure that police officers are going to be less biased? How do you know that they're going to be less biased?
Because the algorithm tells them where to go, instead of just them being able to do whatever they want.
Okay, well at some point at the point. Okay, never. You're good. Okay, so what do you mean by I guess that the technology can reduce jail populations. Why?
So the Stanford evidence I read on the sub-point B tells you that if we're to use predictive policing in courts to predict whether people awaiting trial would commit crimes, then like the algorithm would put less people in jail to await crimes or to await their trial.
Why should an algorithm be able to say whether or not people are going to commit a crime?
Because it would be better for minorities, which are like way disproportionately put in the jail.
How do you predict before somebody commits a crime that they're gonna commit a crime?
Based on a number of factors that judges use, and it's more objective than like a judge who obviously has some sort of human bias. A computer doing it, looking at the variables and factors, is much better than a judge doing it.
Why is surveillance not predictive policing?
Because surveillance would, if you were to use surveillance, you're like seeing a crime happening, and then you're going to the crime scene.
That's not what surveillance is in the context of the 1AC, but okay.
Did they see into the past? Did they see in the future?
I guess why does looking at historical injustices not a good enough justification for why predictive policing is bad? Like why
can you repeat the question?
Hold on. I'll take flex prep starting now.
Okay.
Why do the potential benefits of predictive policing outweigh all of the harms that predictive policing and policing have caused to Black people now?
Okay, yeah, sure. First, you're trying to delegitimize predictive policing by saying that without any evidence. So the entire AC doesn't talk about how bad predictive policing is. It talks about a bunch of what is it, surrendering to Blackness, and like how the entire society is how the entire society is like policing is key to like the plantations and things like that. You never give any evidence on how bad predictive policing is. You never tell me that this many people are arrested unjustly because of predictive policing or anything like that. You just say that it could be a problem or it's like representative of the past and things like that, but you never tell me why it's bad.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so the order is going to be AC starting with a little overview and some framing, and then we're going to go on to the AC proper, then okay, are you good? The very idea of surveillance is founded on the violent policing of black bodies and no cost independent. Any discussions about the use of predictive policing must center black bodies, recognizing that the predictive policing system is only an example of the continuation of foundation of modern society. Black self-defense and attempt to oppose the system, while important, don't actually do anything to structurally change it. And the 1AC embraces life at the edge of the world as a way of black survival in an anti-black world. On to the AC this debate is a question of ethics. Insofar as we've proven that predictive policing is anti-black, you vote AF. They're going to try to make these claims that, like, oh, in the future it can be used to do good, but the possibility of predictive policing being able to be good in the future doesn't matter when right now black people are continuously being harmed and murdered because of its ill use now, and there's no guarantee that it's going to be used properly. So per the Brady Merlo evidence extend that the role about to surrender to black means that we need to reject anti-blacks in every instance, and that reject anti-blacks in every instance and forefront these black voices because they are the ones that the most they are the one most harmed. And my opponent even says that we have an obligation to protect those who are and look to the struggles of those who are being most harmed by the system. In this case, it is black people, which we'll get to that in a second. And then my opponent tries to say that no one cares about surrendering to blackness, and that this doesn't make sense. But yes, they do. Surrendering to blackness just means forefronting the pain and suffering of black people. This is literally the whole Black Lives Matter movement. This is the whole point of why people are protesting right now. They're saying we need to center black voices and their experience in our discussions. All right, onto the AC proper. Extend the Brown 15 evidence that the pleasure gained from inflicting violence on black bodies on the plantation, indict policing as a form of pleasure in white society. This foregrounds the libidinal investments in black pain that are necessary for white coherence. The plantation surveillance is the foundation of all forms of surveillance in the U.S., and that's why predictive policing is only a continuation of this. My opponent says that I am disrespectful to slaves to compare the two, but I'm not saying that slaves, people who were enslaved, are the same as people now, but rather the systems that exist that allowed for slavery to occur are still in place, right? The same anti-black violence that allowed for people to enslave people, ancient blackness has not gone away or even decreased. It's still present in our structures in society. That is what the AC is talking about. And then you're going to extend the Benjamin 19 card. My opponent does not respond to either the Benjamin cards that specifically say that the preemptive logic of predictive policing and the data that they produced are as a result of the presumed criminality of black, that black people are seen as criminal, and they weaponize the experiences, the fact that, like, there are a lot of structural barriers that black people have, and they weaponize that as a reason to justify over policing and a continuation of these cycles of violence. And my opponent cannot solve for this. And if you're going to extend the Woods evidence that goes completely dropped, name them: Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Sandra Bland, Corinne Gaines, and all of the black girls in South Carolina represent the result of black self-defense in the face of policing. The violence that black bodies face is constructed as a fault of black people themselves, necessitating that violence in the first place. The 1AC is a recognition of this futility in the face of structurally anti-black society, embraces the idea of life at the edge as a survival strategy. We're not saying that we solve for all of anti-blacks, but rather that black people, by recognizing that they should work outside the system, will actually be able to do more than trying to work within the system. All right, onto the AC, onto the NC. They say that predictive policing benefits the security of a turn. The notion of security is rooted in anti-black violence. This is the Benjamin caused by the Brown 15 card, that the idea, the restriction of black mobility and policing in general is the idea of is only designed in order to create safety and security for white people. And they say that predictive policing mitigates anti-black violence, but you can extend the Benjamin 19 card that specifically talks about how predictive policing is concentrated in predominantly black areas that are seen as problem areas, and that predictive policing only is a continuation, that they specifically use this software in Atlanta in order because they presume that it was inherently criminal. There's a reason why that Pride poll was tested. It was originally tested in an area of majority black people. And my opponent does not resolve this. And also, again, my opponent, using predictive policing, my opponent does not actually do anything to talk about the way that the structures still exist in the world in which we have predictive policing, and we're not challenging these structures. The NC does anything, and insofar as we've proven that predictive policing is being used anti-black, as you vote AF. Policing system in general is voting AF. I embrace the edge of the world and affirm.
Okay. Sure. It's gonna be going negative, affirmative, and then voters, which I guess don't really matter. No. Okay, so the way we're going to be evaluating this round, basically, as my opponent says towards the beginning of the speech, like surrendering to blackness is forefronting black issues, or we're minimizing structural violence. So whoever creates a society at the end of this round that's better for black and brown people, that's better for minorities as a whole, it wins this round. So let's look at the first contention. When they say that security is anti-black, the problem I have with this is I wouldn't have a problem if they were saying this without the Reed evidence. The thing is that the Reed evidence is right there, and I link it to the idea of security. So what Professor Reed says is that black people are both underprotected, but at the same time over-policed in these black and brown communities. So I'm specifically linking to an idea that isn't security, that isn't like security and policing being anti-black. We need to have security and policing in black communities that is proper, and that's what I outlined in the second contention. Notice that the second contention is heavily untouched because they can't do any work on the actual limiting of bias from predictive policing. All they have is this sort of high in the sky idea that the debate is around ethics, and we should be looking at like different sorts of implications of how blackness comes about and why the society as a whole is anti-black. But they don't do anything to actually do good for black people. They don't respond to the idea that, or not the idea, the facts that I outlined in Gorner and Sweeney, the facts that I outlined with the Ludwig evidence, that using predictive policing is a net good for black and brown people. They don't respond to this. So let's look at the affirmative. Let's look at the affirmative side. At the top, basically the negative is a continuation of an unjust society. It's, yeah, you can say it's a continuation of the unjust society, but it's building upon the society and making it better. If you were to compare 1870, the United States to right now, obviously the system looks nothing alike. And when they say the debate is about ethics, this high in the sky like ethics debate does nothing to help black and brown people. Saying policing was key to the plantation in the past doesn't do anything. What are we supposed to do? Get rid of the police force? That is infeasible. This is an argument completely ignorant to what happens in the real world and what happens to actual black people and like black people that are struggling and hurting right now because of different policymaking that happens because of our like representatives and our leaders. Now, on to the next argument on the Benjamin Amendment. I gave two arguments here. First was that there's going to be historically more crime in black neighborhoods, and I gave you reasons why. It's because of the socioeconomic stance or status of black people in general. Second, that predictive policing limits its bias. They completely skip over both of those arguments and say instead that I didn't respond to him, and that like predictive policing being like used in black and brown neighborhoods is a result of presumed criminality. So just cross-play the response I've already made, and it's a result of like black people historically committing more crimes, or black people committing more crimes right now because they're more likely to be poor. The solution to that isn't surrendering to blackness. It isn't doing anything like that. It's instituting different policies that help black people get out of the situations they're in right now. Now let's look at the next piece of evidence. I say that it's disrespectful to black slaves. They make the same argument here that they did earlier. They say the systems are still here. But like I said earlier, the systems look nothing like they did when black people were enslaved in this country. It's completely outrageous to even say that the systems are the same. The fact that I can walk outside right now into a white neighborhood is proof, and that I don't like, I'm not like being enslaved or anything. That is proof that the systems look nothing alike. Even if it's the same system and we're still in the United States of America, it's completely still ridiculous and absolutely disrespectful to compare the systems we have right now where black people may be prosecuted more, but they surely aren't enslaved, to compare this system right now to black people being enslaved in the past. That's still ridiculous. Them saying that the system is still there doesn't do enough work to get rid of the disrespect they've had onto black slaves of the past. Now, when I respond by saying that using rights can work, they never respond to this. So they say the crux of their argument is that we can't use rights, so what are we supposed to use? Like, we just need to surrender to blackness. That isn't working, or that won't work. That's completely ridiculous. And we need to use the rights we have right now. The rights we have to protest in Oklahoma City down the street from me, the rights we have to protest up in Minnesota can be enough and will be enough to get good policy making through the legislation system and to actually improve black people's lives, and not just say that like policing was a key to like plantations and things like that. Now let's look at the next argument. They basically back they basically backstep on this idea of surrendering to blackness. They say like, it's just forefronting black issues. If we're going to like take down their own like Brady Murillo card and just say that it's forefronting black issues, that's been happening since the middle of the 20th century. Black issues have been forefronted and forefronted and forefronted and put at the head of the media and put in a lot of different things. You can't go on Twitter right now for more than 2 seconds and not see something about George Floyd. And that's a good thing because it gets things done. This idea of surrendering to blackness gets nothing done. So you're going to end up voting ass in the end. Yeah, right. Sure. No, negative. Sure. Okay, so voting issues. So in the end, you're either voting for an ass world that does nothing for black people and brown communities. They never tell you why predictive policing is bad. They never tell you like the impacts of it. Like you can read through their evidence and just ask the same question. But what does that do right now? What does that do? The Benjamin evidence. What does that do? The Wood evidence. What happens? What does that look like? Because it looks like nothing. It's just this idea. So on that, surrendering to blackness is completely useless. You won't use it for the role of the ballot, and it's a paranoid idea about what technology can do for us in the future. Technology is ultimately good, and the covering of my second intention shows that they can't attack the racial bias arguments because I decrease racial bias and I do good things for black people. They completely ignore the effects. So you like the negative here wins off of the entire second intention, and the fact that I'm actually making I'm actually making lives better for black and brown people, and not just saying like the entire society as a whole needs to quote unquote surrender to blackness, because in the end that means nothing. What matters is policy decisions, what happens in 2020, like what happens, everything like that, the protest right now, using our rights to actually get things done, not this vague idea of blackness as a society. Thank you.
Okay, the order is going to be on the AC, starting with some framing. Then we're going to go to the AC proper, then You good? This debate is a question of ethics insofar as you have proven that predictive policing is anti-Black, then you vote F. You can extend the Brady and Merlo 14 evidence that you need to surrender to Blackness. This means a rejection of anti-Black violence in every instance. My opponent continues to try to say that surrendering to Blackness does nothing and that it doesn't mean anything, but literally, yes, it does. And my opponent says that Black issues should be forefronted. That's literally what surrendering to Blackness means. All it means is that we forefront the voices of Black people and their experiences. And my opponent says that this is good, but then says that we shouldn't do it. That's what surrendering Blackness just means, that we need to forefront the experiences of Blackness. This is why people say Black Lives Matter. This is why these movements are so important, is because they do forefront the experience of Black people. And my opponent says that my opponent tries to say that people are continuing to protest and that he says that the systems look nothing alike and that he's able to walk into a white neighborhood. A Black delivery driver went into a white neighborhood to do his job and deliver, but was literally called the cops on and stopped for over an hour. This just shows how things are not necessarily different in every instance, and that a lot of Black people are still suffering from the same systems, and the systems do look similar. The outcome of the systems may look different, but the systems are still in place of anti-Black violence. The Constitution and things that allowed for slavery to happen are still in place. Those same systems haven't changed. All right, and you're going to extend the with the Benjamin 19 evidence that the preemptive logic of predictive policing, the data that are produced are as a result of the presumed criminality of Blackness. This is literally why why Pred Paul was tested in Atlanta, because it is a majority Black area that people assume that they're over criminal, that they need to be policed. And my opponent says that my opponent goes for this argument that okay, so yeah, we're gonna go on to the MC proper, and my opponent says that the systems that predictive policing is actually limits this bias and that people have the right to protest now, but predictive policing uses the structural struggles of people of color in order to justify this over policing. And he goes for this range evidence that says that there's over policing, but people aren't responding fast enough. But there's no evidence that indicates that over policing is going to stop as a result of implementing predictive policing. There's no evidence that indicates that. Maybe police respond faster to violence, but that doesn't mean that over policing in those areas is going to just cease to continue. And also, he says that the systems look nothing like, and that people are able to use their right to protest, and that's why embracing life at the edge of the survival strategy doesn't matter. But you can see people are trying to use their rights in the protest, peacefully protesting, yet they're still being tear gassed, shot grenades are sent into the crowds. This is just indicative of how whenever Black people and people of color try to use their rights, it is met with a completely different reaction than whenever other minorities, rather than whenever white people try to use their rights. This is why you're going to affirm and embrace life at the edge of the world as a way of recognizing that violence through the police state is bad, and that we need to look outside of this instead of just trying to work within these systems.
All right, goodbye. That was a fun round.
Yes, good job. Good debating.
All right, please.